What's the smoke of the evening?
This is the Cades Cove Cavendish. It comes from the Gatlin Burlier
Okay.
in Gatlinburg, Tennessee.
And is that something you acquired on your honeymoon?
It is, in fact, something I acquired on my honeymoon, along with this lovely briar pipe that came from the same place. In the Bulldog, the bowl is in the Bulldog style, the very long stem.
Okay.
Though it is not a true churchwarden, this stem is only about 5 or 6 inches long. To be a churchwarden, it has to be at least 9.
Yes, you answered my question there. What counts as a church warden? Do you own a church warden?
Regrettably, no.
Have you thought about getting one?
It is on the list, and when my wife and I were recently in the Missouri Meerschaum Corncob Pipe Company, they do have several church warden and church warden-esque pipes there. I almost bought one, but it was actually cheaper for me to buy the 2 that I wound up with.
Okay. Well, 2 pipes is
which
better
will
than
be
one,
featured in
generally
future
speaking.
episodes.
All right. And we will be there for that. What's the drink of the evening? I have no smoking substance to share any news about.
So this that I'm currently drinking looks like whiskey, but it's actually gin.
What led you down the gin route?
Well, the fact that we have a fine distillery here in Missouri, in New Haven.
Very nice.
Called the Pinckney Bend Distillery.
Pinckney Bend, okay. Very solid.
So they make several gins. This cask finished one is called that because they make the gin and then they let it age for a year in an old whiskey cask.
Okay. Is it more vanilla? Like vanilla taste as a result?
A little bit. It has a little bit of that vanilla taste, but it takes a lot of the sort of gin bite out of it.
Okay.
And then, because it puts the tannins and that other sort of smoothness from corn whiskey in there.
It's Pinckney Blend. Well, thankfully, Raymond is showing up soon, so I might be able to get some. Back down there.
We might make a trip out of it if you can stay for a fair amount of time.
I think I can make that work. For my own drink of the evening, I am also drinking something local, even though it's not Minnesotan. It's from Wisconsin. It is the Spotted Cow from New
That's not
Brewing.
local. That's
Close
not
enough.
local. I know you're closer to North Dakota than you are to Wisconsin.
No, that's not true. I'm like less than an hour away from Wisconsin. The Twin Cities are pretty close to the Wisconsin border, relatively speaking. So,
oh, I got my geography wrong then.
Oh, you're not from up here. I'm not from down there. I couldn't.
My homeschooling mom is cringing right now, and she has no idea why.
Well, she ain't here to listen, so maybe she will. We will see. But yeah, this is Spotted Cow from New Glarus. This is a bit of a cult favorite up here because you can only get it in Wisconsin. As you can imagine, there are places right on the border where you can fetch this type of stuff. And this is just a regular ale, but brewed according to the purity law of whatever year that became a thing. So, made with yeast, hops, water, and malted barley, and nothing but. So, it's not like a spectacular beer. It's not like a Dragon's Milk or Chimay Blue type of beer, but it is just a very fine beer in its own right, and it's hard to argue with.
That's a very, very solid choice.
And if we get into second libations, I've got Four Roses small batch over there. So
I have a plain old Four Roses that I could potentially get into.
Very good.
But we shall see.
We shall see. Well, what would you like to discuss around the fire this evening?
Well, I think a good topic is work. We had discussed as being our first topic, so why don't we get into that?
Indeed. Well, we wanted to talk about work, and currently we are in the year of our Lord 2025. We're 5 years removed from the hell that was COVID. And 6 years ago, while you and I were in college, you, Mary, the world of work, I think, looked pretty different. I think your expectations, or one's expectations for work, one's employer's expectations for work, were different than what they are now. The form factor of it is very different. I've heard somebody say quite well about it that, to make remote work happen at the speed of it did. We took years and years of innovation and we boiled it down into 2 weeks back in March and April of that year. So
Right.
much changed with that. And so perhaps it's worth sitting back thinking with, the benefit of hindsight now. What do we think of those changes? And what can we learn from them? And what principles can we draw out of them to inform how you and I work so that we can work better?
Well,
Of course, that's a mouthful. There's a lot to get in there.
I
But,
think,
I mean, what was COVID like for you?
well, that year was my first and only year professionally as a teacher. And everybody, I think, will agree that was not the right year to try to start teaching.
For sure, yeah.
Because I remember, students, I had to be very careful about how closely the desks in my classroom were situated. There were all these really weird rules. The students weren't allowed to do everything together as an entire school. Stuff was always separated. I had to wear a mask the entire day, presumably because I'd spend the entire day talking. And as we all know, talking makes people ill.
Yes. The wise and holy ones did decree this.
And there was even one situation in which one of my students had tested positive for COVID. And so the entire school then goes into online mode. And this was a primary school, so it's from first grade through 8th grade. So we had first and second graders doing online school, which is a topic for another time.
Makes sense.
After that, my wife had gotten a job someplace else, so we moved away from there and I stopped teaching.
Mhm.
And that was in 2021, so that was still when we were sort of ruled by the fear of the COVID monster. And my wife, her job was just in a cubicle, basically, so that it didn't really affect her, except for meetings when we were like, yeah, just come in, but don't touch anybody or really look at anybody because, that can make people sick.
Uh-huh. Visual.
And I spent that time, one, attempting to kickstart my writing career, Saints and Six Guns, now published on Kindle.
Check it out.
Episodes 1 through 5, episode 6 coming soon. I tried to jumpstart or kickstart a writing career, and also tried to search for actual work that I could then, use to support the two of us. And I found it very difficult. And for some reason, to get employers to respond. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, or rather I wasn't at the time. I think perhaps at the time, jobs that would have required in-person work probably were cautious about hiring new people. And all the remote jobs, probably a lot of them don't really want to go through the hassle of trying to train somebody to do remote work.
Yeah, makes sense.
But I think overall, what the experience kind of taught us about work, and this is just coming from what I've heard other people talk about, and even to an extent in my own experience, the number of people that said, during COVID, I started working from home and realized that I could have been working from home the entire time.
Yeah, a number of people did
Depending
say
on
that.
what your job is.
Mhm.
For instance, my father's retired, but he had been, and was at the time, a structural engineer for the State Transportation Department. Now, he still insisted on going into the office when everybody else was told to stay home, but that partially had to do with them living in a rural area and not having very good internet. So that would have made it difficult for him to be on Zoom meetings and to upload projects and things like that. He had also said that, the job of the engineer when you design things for a living can be effectively and competently done from home. As long as you have the CAD program and you know what you're doing and you can get projects done and turned in on time and your bridges still don't fall down without reason, it can still be done. So really the only reason that my dad actually did go into the office was because of his bad internet. They've since gotten better internet, and I think if he'd had this internet now, or had the internet now that had the internet then that they have now, I think he probably would have stayed home.
Okay. Do you know about what percentage of people at his job took the work from home route with there?
Almost everybody.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people, particularly those that just kind of worked in the cubicle world widget factory, I think they kind of all realized that, this job can really just be done from home. And with some employers, when you realize that, why don't we just have people work from home? Yeah, some people, you might not get the most productivity, but that's also kind of how you figure out who actually is useless. Because it's really easy to pretend like you're working in an office or in an actual active workspace. A lot harder when you have assignments to do at home. But of course, we've all seen, the comedy bits of people who are on Zoom calls and are actually playing solitaire. That we've all seen that.
I've seen that, but that's an interesting contrast because, yeah, on one hand, we've seen all those, but on the other hand, if you're in the office, you can, to a degree, distract your boss with conversation and busy work, and you're still there staring at the computer. They can see you there staring at the computer, typing, doing something. I don't know. Maybe it's just easier to get into a mindset sometimes of, like, everybody's here, everybody's working. Stuff looks good at the end of the week, fine. But then when you're not in the office, then your boss has time to think, and when they have time to think, they have time to question. And when they have time to question,
Yeah.
they have to wonder, well, what exactly is Joe Schmo doing? And now you can only judge it off of metrics, and their metrics may be obscured before, and now can't be obscured.
Right. So, I don't know. I think overall, at least this is what we thought in the early days of coming out of COVID. I think things are, from what I've been seeing, I think things are starting to shift back to people still wanting to go out to the office every day. But I think some people did learn that, remote work is better for some people. And that'll be, we'll return to that later on. As to why I personally think that there does need to be a clearly drawn definition of lines that can be done from home and should be done from home, and the ones that you definitely need to be physically in a space for.
We'll come back to that, yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with, we can probably trace a lot of that to the history of work.
Well, I am an IT major.
Actually, we'll come back to that right now, but yeah, you go ahead.
All I'm going to say is I'm an IT major, but this is where I turn all of it over to you as the history major. So, and work is such a big topic, like that's hard to tackle in an episode, and there's no way to do it.
Yeah,
it's a massive bite to choose. So,
just we're going to talk about work in general.
Exactly.
Okay, have fun.
Pretty big. But that just means there's a large canvas, and you can make whatever painting you want on that, and it's going to be good. So, I mean, with regards to the challenges we've seen, like, I guess, how did we get here? What were things like? We always talk about, well, our grandparents had it better than us in these ways, and not better than us in plenty of other ways. But there's a sense in many people that there's something respectable and something honorable that I think that we lost with time, as technology and things has changed, and if things have changed, and if people has changed, and as people have changed. So I don't know. How have things changed?
Well, I can tell you they certainly have, as having a history degree myself. I will make it clear I am not a progressive historian. I don't think that just because we go forward means that we're doing better. I think that we should approach progress with caution. And part of the reason for this has to do with what I think of work. You know, work for the longest time in human society, it was just kind of part of life. It wasn't like everybody nowadays talks about that work-life balance. Back then, in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, they didn't need a work-life balance because their work and their life were intertwined. So I think that's because most people just lived and worked kind of in the same place. Unless you were, extremely wealthy or extremely successful, which, the metric by which we judge success is kind of stupid, but more on that later too. Majority of people throughout human history up until about 5 minutes ago were tradesmen, laborers, farmers, and it was either that your work was sort of built around your community, or your community was built around your work, or you lived and worked in the same place. So like the village blacksmith, he has his house and then he has the forge either right next door or right out front or right out back or whatever. And this kind of is constant for a considerable amount of human history. And this is how some of the first cities were actually built as well, or at least how early cities were built, was that your home and your place of business were the same place. So you had portions of your home that were for living and then portions of your home that were for business. Unless, of course, you were a member of a noble class or, like I said before, extremely wealthy, to be able to afford a villa someplace else. But so this is going to get into a pretty deep conversation. So that started to change, I think, kind of slowly, or in a more steady way. Definitely after the Enlightenment, which is the Enlightenment is a direct result of the Reformation, because after the Reformation, we decided, hey, we can't talk about religion anymore. And when you stop talking about religion anymore, you kind of stop thinking about it. So when you stop thinking about it, it then gets replaced with a whole bunch of other silly ideas, which is why I'm personally I consider any Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment ideology to be suspect at best.
And for those, tell me if my own understanding of the Enlightenment is wrong, because I'm sure plenty of other people's will be. It's basically a movement away from religion and towards reason alone, which is by definition unreasonable. But that's
not solely a specific movement away from reason or away from religion and toward reason alone. Because a lot of the great Enlightenment thinkers were Christians and were practicing Christians. So the Enlightenment is more sort of this explosion that happens. If we divide history into periods, so you have the Renaissance and then you have the Enlightenment, which starts kind of at the tail end of the 17th century and then goes through the 18th and then into the 19th century, which is then when we get the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
But the Enlightenment was kind of a return to both a return and a moving forward at the same time. It was this time when people are just thinking about things, and it's called the Enlightenment because we're enlightening our minds and we're learning a lot more, a lot faster.
Makes sense.
And we're just, thinking about things a lot more. Which, the ironic thing is that people started sinning a lot more during the Enlightenment, and sin darkens the intellect and weakens the will, when the Enlightenment was all about enlightening the intellect. But anyway, also another topic for another time. So it's kind of this explosion of science. Like, Isaac Newton is considered one of the earliest Enlightenment thinkers.
Okay.
Because of his studies into the sciences. And there are a lot of early Enlightenment scientists that did wonderful things and had breakthroughs in the fields. And they were mostly Christians. It was the philosophers that we had to worry about. It was men like Voltaire and Rousseau, who basically just walk around and talk about things. Kind of like what we're doing. They would think, and then they would talk about what they were thinking about. But the Enlightenment philosophers are kind of more dangerous than the Enlightenment scientists, and they were really some of the ones who were bringing God out of the equation. And if they talked about him, they had these very corny sort of modern notions. It came to be called deism. Because it's basically, well, I believe in a God, but I also kind of don't think he has a whole lot to do with us, but I also kind of think he does, but I also, and this and that, and this and that.
Sure.
Thomas Jefferson is a very, one of the more prominently known deists, although the kind of things that he wrote are not super well distributed.
Okay. Is it fair to say that within that, and perhaps motivating it, there's just an impulse to, see what would the right words be? Like an opening of the sciences, like a beginning of understanding in sciences. Like, I can understand this, I can understand this, I can understand this, I can think about this, and I can think about this, and there's cool stuff that comes of that. And now I make the presumptuous mistake of thinking that I can determine everything there is to know about the world. And then eventually
that is kind of where
if
that
you're
comes from.
wise enough, you figure out that no, the mystery gets greater and greater and deeper, and you just get stuck. You've learned more, but you also haven't at the same time.
Yeah, it isn't really this. That is kind of where it comes from. That because I know a lot of things about a lot of things, I know everything about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of things that came out of it. But probably one of the philosophies, the one philosophy above most others that sort of took hold in academics and then wound up shaping the way that people worked, because again, this particular episode is about work.
Mm-hmm.
I would say is utilitarianism, which is, well, how do we secure the greatest good for the greatest amount of people? And coming from Hume, and what a shocker, Hume was not thinking of the greatest good in the way that Aquinas or Aristotle thinks of the greatest good, as being just the highest virtue. He was trying to make as most people as comfortable as humanly possible.
Okay. Where was
then
what country was Hume from?
Scottish.
Okay.
Yeah, he was just kind of a very strange guy to begin with. He was a kind of a blatant atheist, agnostic at best.
Okay.
So he basically thought that, the best thing that we can possibly do is to just make ourselves as comfortable as possible. And that winds up getting sort of in the mind of businessmen, because during the Enlightenment, the British Empire is expanding rapidly. It in less than 100 years winds up conquering 3/4 of the globe. And during the Enlightenment, the East India Trading Company is born. And it basically becomes the world's first global syndicate organization that is separate from, they're intrinsically separated from the government. It had ties with the government, but it is a separate entity, at least claims to be a separate entity. And with the East India Trading Company beginning having this sort of global conglomerate that is based on the British Empire, as well as the rapid expansion of the idea of utilitarianism, ultimately we find the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And this also has to do with progressivism taking place.
In this movement where we seem to be expanding out of our more trade-centric communities and towns.
The Industrial Revolution is the birth of factories. And that happens kind of in the beginning of the 19th century, but really after the first quarter of the 18th century is where it really starts to take off. And it was in the fullest swing of its early stages during the American Civil War. And is one of the reasons that the Union was able to win. One of the big reasons that the Union was able to win, because the North had sort of fully embraced industry and was building factories and was, cranking out product. They were cranking out weapons, particularly for the North. Mm-hmm. Whereas the South, they did have some factories, but their approach to work was different. It was kind of the way everything is done in the South. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. And sometimes it's worth doing slowly if that means doing it right. So they weren't anywhere near able to produce the same amount of weaponry and equipment as the North was. Also because the South just made most of their money on agriculture, on tobacco, cotton, and sugar. So with the Industrial Revolution comes the birth of the factory and the birth of the early stages of the mass production of product. But what does that do to the workman? Because, for a long time, being a common laborer just meant you went out and you picked grapes in somebody's vineyard, or you went out and you worked on a construction site, or you went out, you did something.
Mm-hmm.
But, you were able to do a lot of things and contribute to a lot of different places. But after the Industrial Revolution, it kind of becomes this common laborer is just this half-witted grunt that we put in a factory so we can crank out as much product as humanly possible, and we pay him basically nothing.
Hmm.
And, you wind up having a currency-based economy instead of a trade-based economy, so everybody needs money. But when you go in and ask for a job, the factory foreman says, all right, be here at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you'll work until 6 o'clock in the evening. If you're lucky. And, well, what does that do? That winds up taking fathers away from their families, for one thing. And, well, I did forget to mention that there winds up being a higher proportioned number of common laborers at this point, rather than tradesmen, rather than people pursuing what they're good at, and that includes things like the arts, because other arts and other trades, because of this idea of, well, why would I pay a man to make something in a week that the factory can make in a day? And a lot of that kind of has to, it sort of removes the end result of the trade from the heart of the workman.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of this is kind of when the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, no holds barred, and we didn't care. At the end of and again, this is primarily in the cities, at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So we'll take, for example, a dressmaker's factory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at one time, every woman just knew how to sew. So your mother just made all your clothes. She went out and bought the fabric, and she just made all your clothes. And the dressmaker was an artist. She was a particular woman who came and took measurements of particular people, and those really never went away. But for the common people, a common woman buying a dress, it became not so much about, well, you need a dress, you make a new dress, or you make the old one last as much as you possibly can. It became, we're going to get a hold of a bunch of raw materials at a premium, and we're going to give these to our workers, who are all these women that we're just going to lock into a room for 12 hours or more a day, and demand that they crank out however many dresses in that amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Completed full dresses in that amount of time.
Which reduces both from the beauty of the work done and of the work produced.
Yeah.
I would think.
It reduces, also reduces the dignity of the worker, which is kind of the ultimate thing.
Mm-hmm.
That is the highest of those things, although the work should be good and it should be beautiful, because a dress is a work of art. Clothes are works of art, as well as having, the function of covering our nakedness, which is what everybody should be doing.
It's interesting we say that, and yet I'm wearing a company polo and you're wearing a t-shirt, but like it's fitting and it's true at the same time.
I'm in my house, I'm comfortable.
Well, yes, I'm not saying you should have anything different, but it's like, even if these are, I might come back to this later, but even though these are poor works of art in that sense, because they're in bulk, mine is a logo, cool. Like they don't have that same spirit to them that the older stuff has, as you described.
Right.
Or not that it doesn't have it, but it's less easily seen, I think.
And, part of those things, because it became more about, because out of the Enlightenment we get a lot of the modernist and the secularist ideologies, which wind up fueling the more wealthy and the higher educated people in society, who wind up being the ones that run these companies. So they end up in their industrial mindset thinking, all right, well, how can I make more money?
Mm-hmm.
Well, by paying my workers next to nothing and by working them excessively. Because then what that does, and then you can reason your way through this, then I can put out more products and I can sell them to people for less than they would be buying from, somebody who, like a particular maker of that thing. That I can produce a whole bunch of them. I'm improving my life and the lives of my customers. But because I have more customers than I have workers, I can just shit on my workers all that I want. Because thanks to utilitarianism, we are providing the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, which is money.
Yep. And so you focus on the money and the thousands of people that you're serving, without focusing on the hundreds of people that you're employing. So,
right.
At least as much. So, and it truly, the word utilitarianism is appropriate, I think. I also think it's interesting earlier that, around the time of the Civil War, during the Civil War, you have the establishment of the IRS, which I think plays into this somehow too, as you move from a trade-based economy.
That's the government going, hey, how can we take advantage of all this?
Yes. Moving from a trade-based economy to a currency-based economy, to an extent, this is more feasible, and there's an excuse for it. And then soon after that, you have the development of the Prussian school system, which has inspired public schools to this day. And that, by its nature, churns out more utilitarian-ready factory workers.
Yeah.
Or at least that type of mindset.
Which will be a topic of discussion in our episode on education.
Yes, indeed. Because we have not just chosen one episode to bite off a massive topic. We can pick more.
Yeah, we can incoherently stuff ourselves in multiple episodes.
Yes, very much.
So, where was I? Ah, yes, the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So the Industrial Revolution is sort of where the birth of the idea of capitalism comes from.
So John Locke was earlier, though, wasn't he?
Free trade and capitalism are two different things, and
Okay.
pure capitalism are two different things.
Okay.
Yeah, Locke was an Enlightenment thinker.
Okay.
Technically speaking, was Enlightenment. So because we have one, a decline of general morality among the ruling elite and among the wealthy elite. Two, I forgot to mention something else that happens at this time, is that we start changing how we think about government as well, rather than, rule being rather than going to a king for rule, we wind up having a ruling class that kind of had no business ruling, had no business being in charge. They were all sort of professionals in some area or another, and wound up creating entirely new governments.
I want to ask more about that. How did that
Well, for
develop?
example, our founding fathers really had no business trying to run a country. The only one who did was John Adams. He was the one who had probably the greatest ability, or the greatest intellectual ability at politics.
Okay.
Because he was also one of the most moral of all of our founding fathers. But yeah, I mean, guys like Paul Revere was a silversmith. Is what he did professionally.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Jefferson could write good. Couldn't speak worth a damn, but he could write good. Washington was a professional soldier, and that's all he'd ever known for his entire life. So what business does he have as president of the United States? And these are all things to think about, because this also, it's sort of a shift between, as a result of the French Revolution, it's sort of a shift from we are subject to the king as we are subject to God. And the nations of Christendom and the nations of the West had modeled themselves on a monarchical structure, for one thing, because all of the ancient civilizations that they were birthed out of had that, but also because kings just kind of work. And because the kingdom of God is not a democracy, why should the kingdom of man be? And if you're just you follow the most qualified guy, or at least who you perceive to be the most qualified guy. It's just kind of where the line of kings comes from. And the assumption is that because of how trades worked, you passed your trade down to your son. You taught him how to do your job so that when he grows up, he takes over and he does it better. The king presumably is going to be teaching his sons how to do that. And, because man is not perfect, that winds up not happening in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
But after the French Revolution, there's this idea of, we don't need kings anymore. And after the French Revolution, and particularly after the American Revolution, there's this idea that sort of starts spreading of, we don't need kings anymore, which granted is not sort of fully taken root in Europe or in the world in general until like the middle of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But there's this, we don't need God anymore, so we don't need kings anymore. We can pick our own leaders and our own rulers from amongst ourselves. And we, the people, can ultimately decide what we want. And, rather than it being passed down from father to son, we can just pick the next guy and vote the next guy out when we don't like him anymore. That's also sort of where the idea of, you can kind of be whatever you want to be comes from. Like, this is America, where we can be what we want to be. You don't have to do what your father did. You can sort of do your own job, make your own path, that sort of thing. Which is not always a bad thing, but when there is no longer a specific class of people to rule, it leaves a void that needs to be filled. And at that point, the merchant class starts stepping in because they're like the next rung down from the noble class.
Okay.
The aristocrats start stepping in. The wealthy people start stepping in. And I mean, England had had the parliamentary system for a long time at that point, when a bunch of lords decided to corner King John in the woods and say, hey, we're going to overthrow you if you don't sign this. But like when you take the Congress and other houses of parliament in the world, when you put a whole bunch of rich men in a room together, it's very difficult to find that many rich men who don't all have the priority of making each other and themselves more rich.
Mm-hmm. This is true.
And, so they wind up taking over politically, and they wind up kind of taking over culturally as well. Not the same people, but we have people with this sort of mindset in government, and we have people with this mindset running companies, where it's all about the efficiency and how fast can we get things out, which is why Ford invented the assembly line. And everybody always goes, oh, great, the assembly line, it's so great because we can get so many products out so much quicker, so much good stuff. And really, it's sort of this late Renaissance to post-Enlightenment idea that the dignity of man is reflected in his social status and in the contents of his pockets. Because the poorer classes sort of start to imitate the wealthier classes, and this starts spreading more and more and more and more and more.
Which
where,
ironically
the
makes
low,
the wealthier classes wealthier and the poorer classes poor.
the true poorest of the poor, yes, they ultimately just get poor, but they start imitating the wealthy. And the reason that industrialism kind of, and particularly things like the assembly line and factories, the reason they're so influential and they take hold so quickly is because they can put things in people's hands that had previously not been afforded to them. Like when Ford created the assembly line, it made cars cheaper to produce, which meant that he could lower the cost of the car, which meant more people could afford it, which meant more people bought cars, which ultimately meant he made more money. Again, we have the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but who suffers on the assembly line? It's his workers. Because Henry Ford also came up with the idea of the company store, which got adopted by a lot of people for a long time. And
Say more.
the company store is this idea where you as the worker are not actually paid in real money. You as the worker are paid in fake corporate money that the company has come up with. And we have a company store that has all of the bare necessity needs for a human being to survive, but they're also usually not the best quality because they also are produced in a factory that we have gotten super cheap, and we have put a small portion of our profits towards getting. So you can go to the company store and spend your Ford dollars on whatever canned goods and potentially dry goods and other things it is, but you are not able to go and purchase anything from anywhere else.
Yeah, so what we've done is we've taken the small town tradesman community of ages past. We've changed it, through the Industrial Revolution, and now with the company store and this whole system, we've recreated the small town in a sense. We've recreated what's now the factory town. You're all going to know your people. You're going to know your coworkers. You're going to live next to them. You're going to get all your stuff from the same spot. It's just all going to be worse than it was before.
And that was actually the brainchild of a man named Hershey. That is why Hershey, Pennsylvania exists. Because he came up with the idea of, I have all these workers that work in this factory. Why don't I just build a town around the factory? That way everybody lives in a close distance to the factory. And then we can have schools, and we can have churches, and we can have other things in the factory. which is kind of, that ultimately happens anyway, sort of when you build a conglomerate, or not, conglomerate's not the right word. When you build a factory or anything like that, the workers, when you have to commute, the workers are going to want to build a town around it. Which is why we have a lot of companies. I think there's a company in Alaska that built basically an entire town in an apartment building. Because it gets so cold that they can't rely on everybody's cars having to start to be able to get to work.
Oh, clever.
And that's not necessarily a horrible thing. And I'm perfectly okay with, your work and your home being pretty close to one another. The idea is that a man be able to work from home, and this is coming from the perspective of a married man with children. Coming from the perspective of a father. It's, what is it that I really, really want? It's, well, I don't want to look at you schmucks all day. I'd rather be near my children and have a job where I can be around my children. And there's more on that later when we get through the history sort of portion of this. So after the Industrial Revolution, or near the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, we get the labor unions, which basically just incite a bunch of riots until they get their way. And to some extent, they were necessary, or they incited borderline riots until they got their way. But like the strike, otherwise known as the national pastime of the French, that and protesting, that's their two national pastimes. So striking.
I want to ask you about those, but I'm not going to.
I only say that because in the 10 days that I spent, the only 10 days I've ever spent in France, that's the 10 days in Paris, I think 3 of them, there was a strike of some kind happening in Paris, and the other 7, there were strikes happening elsewhere in France.
I take it that they didn't last long because the third national pastime of the French is bleaching cloth and flying it on a stick.
Anyway, the whole point of the labor unions was, hey, we as the workers are going to get together and elect leaders from among us to be go-betweens with the companies that we work for. And, if they don't start treating us better, then we're just not going to show up for work.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what a strike is. It's, I want something from you, you're not giving it to me, so I'm just not going to work. And, in most places, they had no recourse other than that. A lot of places, like in New York, they had tried everything else.
I'm no massive pro-union person, at least in the modern sense of the word union and meaning of that word and what it actually is. But it's
I will say there are trades that probably still should have their union, but there are also others that, you didn't really need a union at the beginning, and you definitely don't now.
Yeah. Even though Pope Leo the 12th or the 13th, which one wrote Rerum Novarum?
That was the 13th.
13th, okay. Because he talks about, workers have the right to unionize, organize, all this stuff to, advocate for themselves. And so, good idea, just needs to be done, right. But then again, humanity is kind of good at not doing things, the best that they can. You could say the same about the factory system. In theory, this is a good idea. There are things it serves, but you got to do it right. And there's ways to not do it right.
Which includes, paying your workers properly and making sure that they have good working conditions.
Yep.
And making sure that their work is not excessive and all that sort of thing. And I think a lot of factories do that now. At least the ones that belong to really, really big companies. Smaller company factories, it's not the small company factories or the really big factories that concern me. It's more the medium-sized company that doesn't know whether it wants to be a small company or a big company. It's that sort of thing. It's the one that can't be honest about itself.
Yeah, so the one that has growth as the big the big blazing word in the minds of its executives. You know what I mean?
And then it winds up growing too fast, and then you wind up forgetting, your workers, because the bottom line is very, very large and tends to get in the way.
Yep. And next thing you know, you're sold to some other company, and they, well, depends on the company. Did they care about the bottom line? Did they care about the workers in that? What did they care about? If it's just the bottom line, how many of those people are getting laid off? Or how many of those people are not getting the promotions they would have gotten, or not getting the raises they would have gotten, not getting the care that they would have gotten? Because they really are just, they really are just human resources.
Yeah. Our resource is humans, is people.
Yeah. Sorry to any HR people watching. Your department at large has a terrible name. It really needs a better one. Really.
It should be human. It should be human relations instead of human resources.
I like that.
That makes it a whole lot better. That makes a lot more sense.
I like that. Yeah.
It also is a better name for what they're supposed to be doing.
And it's not a lie, or lie is a strong word, but what I'm reminded of the fact that I worked for a credit union once, and they renamed all the collections people to credit solution specialists. It's not a lie, but nothing about the job change. Like it's just a nicer way to say the same thing. Come on.
So that's something I have to say about also about the modern concept and the progressive concept of work, but that's for a little bit later.
Okay.
Right now we're still in the 1920s. So as that progresses, this is also where the idea of company stock comes from. Even though the stock market is very, very, very old. But then when the stock market crashes in 1929, suddenly now everybody's also out of a job. Because now our companies are worthless. So we can't afford to pay anybody the very little that we were already paying them.
Sure.
And so what you have is like those great few scenes in the movie Cinderella Man. When Jim Brannigan is going to the docks, and he stands at the gate of the docks begging people to let him in because they're only going to hire a certain number of people for that day because they can only afford to hire the certain number of people for that day. And that's kind of how it worked.
Yep.
Anytime, any place there's an economic crash, that's sort of where it goes. Is you wind up being in a large group of people that wanders around looking for work, and you'll take what you can get, and the employers will take what they can get. The movie Ip Man is like this as well. It's set a little bit later, but in the 1930s, after Japan conquers portions of China. This grandmaster of kung fu, who is from a wealthy merchant family, he starts the movie living in a mansion and winds up having to roam the streets and stand at a gate in a crowd begging for the boss to let him in. And that's just how it is any place there's an economic crash.
Yeah. It's easy in the midst of a movie to lose sight of how painful that is, too. Or how painful it would be to be living through that. Because it's a movie, it's a quick scene.
Yeah.
It shows you the idea, but it doesn't show you the hours and days and weeks and months that led up to that of all the same stuff. And years.
It helps a little bit when the actors are as good at acting as Russell Crowe and Donnie Yen are.
Yes.
It does help, but you, again, like you said, you still only see those couple of scenes.
Yep. To have that be the reality for years is just insane,
So after that, we then get World War II. And I will give factories one thing. The American factory system helped us win World War II.
Mm-hmm.
It legitimately is probably the primary contributor to our victories in World War II. That and the strategic prowess of men like Eisenhower and Patton. And of all of the brilliant British strategists as well. As much as it pains me to say as a red-blooded American, giving compliment to the British. but there was a German tank commander who was asked after the war about tank combat. And he said, well, the Panzer tank is the greatest tank on the battlefield, and the Panzer tank is worth 4 American tanks. But the Americans always had 5. And that's kind of it, is that we just crushed Germany under an extreme weight of industry. It's how we produced our tanks that way. We produced our rifles that way, because we like to produce things with as few moving parts as possible. And our tanks in the Second World War were kind of cheaply made. And the Germans used factories too, but it's kind of the way that the factories were used. And in the product that was being produced in the factory anyway. So one of the good things about something being made with as few parts as possible is that they can be assembled a lot more quickly. German tanks are extremely, extremely complicated. So let's say, there's a tank battle happening, and a Panzer tank gets its tread broken, or has something kind of minor happen to it, but enough to incapacitate it.
Mm-hmm.
The entire tank has to then be shipped back to Berlin.
Oh, great!
Where it is then taken apart, the damaged part replaced, and then put back together again. American tanks had tank crews that were all trained on basically how to fix all of their possible tank issues with duct tape and chicken wire.
So what the Germans really needed was right to repair. Is that what you're saying?
What the Germans really needed was rednecks.
Yes.
So, one of the results of... and I'm going to backtrack a little bit before I move forward, because this is important.
Mm-hmm.
One of the results of work in the factories is, like we said, people wanting to live in relatively near distance to the factories. And this is kind of where places like tenement housing and brownstones and places like that come from. They're for the poor who work in the factories and are paid basically nothing, and it's all that they can afford, which is how you wind up having an Irish couple with 12 kids living in a single room apartment someplace in Manhattan. So it's a much lower quality of living for what I think could probably be considered the ordinary man back then. Like, a house is considered a luxury when you live in a city, and you kind of can't afford a house unless unless your job entails you wearing a business suit every day, which is a disproportionately small number of the population in the first quarter of the 20th century. Still, even after the Industrial Revolution and progress. But after the Second World War, there is something of a change that happens. Because when you're overseas for that long a time, when you're in the army for 4 years, you wind up learning a few things. And, if you're a non-commissioned officer, you learn a lot about leadership. And even when you're an officer, you learn a lot about leadership. And you learn a lot about following when you're just, a grunt. When you're a private, or private first class even, or
Sure.
a seaman in the Navy. So when soldiers come back from war, I would say that our boys that came back from the Second World War after defeating Germany have had probably the best reception of any group of United States military that have ever come back from any other war since, or before, to be honest. And there's sort of this idea that, well, they went and fought for us. We can't let these guys just go back to their shitty living situation. We got to do something for them. We got to help, make things better.
Sure.
And it's also just sort of generally a societal thing that they're kind of wanting to get away from having people stacked on top of each other. And thus, you have the suburb. being born. Suburb being short for a suburban area, as opposed to an urban area, as opposed to an actual city. It's not a city, and it's also not a town. It's this weird kind of in-between mini-town thing that's a growth off of a city. I don't like suburbs. Basically, it takes a whole bunch of people. It says, okay, we're going to take a whole bunch of people and put them in the suburbs, and they have everything that they want pretty much within reach. There might be a park, there's a supermarket, there's the sporting goods store. It's kind of where strip malls and shopping malls come about too. It's all about putting as many things as possible into one place for the convenience of the person consuming the good. And on the surface, it sounds pretty good, but what does that do for the man who works? Because we also have this idea that the standard of the ordinary man and of the ordinary job sort of changes, and it's sort of linked to the poor not wanting to act like poor people anymore, or there sort of being a desire to elevate the social status of the poor, where it's kind of more and more people are start going, oh, well, I can't go and work in a factory. That's what poor people do. Oh, I can't go and work in a mine because that's what poor people do. That's what poor people who live out in the country do. I don't want to do that. No, we live in the city. We're progressive now, and we're forward thinking. So I'm going to live in the suburbs in sort of a cookie cutter house that's 98% the same as 8 other houses on my block. I'm going to commute to work. I'm going to drive 45 minutes, or I'm going to take the bus, or I'm going to take the train, and then I'm going to go sit in an office for 8 hours, and I'm going to push pencils and punch numbers and type on a typewriter, and then I'm going to come home and, then remember that I have a family to be with. There's this sort of shift in priorities in society of the kind of jobs that we value. So, like, why does the factory worker get paid very little, but the man that works basically in a brain factory, which is what cubicle world is, why does he get paid double that? Why is that job valued more? Which is kind of where that starts happening. And you can see this in like all of the sitcoms from the 50s and onwards. All of the the basic family sitcoms, like Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best. It's the dad always works in an office, and it sort of paints this picture of the ideal life for a man is you spend 8 hours in an office and then you come home and your wife has dinner ready.
Yeah.
There are of course exceptions to this, and I think there are other sitcoms of the era that I think sort of show a better way of working. But that's basically what the sitcom winds up creating, is because it wants to portray what's normal. But what's normal is, well, my dad works in insurance, or my dad works in some unnamed field, but he works in an office, or he works in business. My dad is a businessman, which is like the most broad bullshit title that I have ever heard for a job. Like, what do you do for a living? Business? What kind of business? The business kind.
Have you heard anybody actually say that, though?
I haven't, but that's basically what I hear when like the upper middle class and very rich business guru types talk about their job.
No,
That's what is in my head every time I hear that.
I think the only way that makes sense is if you're in the business of owning businesses and you own more than you care to mention. And
Yeah, when your entire job is brokering deals.
and managing. But there's an there's an upside and downside to that. The upside I think is pretty obvious, but the downside is now the businesses you own are they're less of the entities that they once were in your mind.
Well, yes, because now they're just a piece of what you own.
Mm-hmm.
They're just a piece of your property at this point. But that also includes all the people that work for you.
Mm-hmm. And there's a way to do that right, but there's definitely a way to do that wrong. So
Yeah, like there are entire corporations whose sole purpose is to own other corporations. Like, do we really need that? Does society really work better with that? And my gut response is no. Like that exists to put more money in somebody's pocket.
yeah. And it's only meant to be that way if it's in the service of others. You know, if you can own a bunch of businesses and care for the people around them and see them as like, hey, I got this really cool flower shop over in city X, and you know, hey, they're taking care of great people over there, and I know some of the customers over there, and I got the barber shop in the town over as well. Clientele's amazing, barber's awesome, like he's been there for 50 years. He's just happy that I'm paying him. Cool, I want him to do his thing. I know, by the way, I got the grocery store in town Z, across the river. Like, if you have that mindset, it's better, you know.
Right.
But in this whole history that you've been narrating, you have a shift away from the personal and towards the utilitarian.
Right. Which is ultimately what happens when you sort of reduce the concept of the human person. For one thing, when you start denying the existence of the soul, which is what makes people equal in the eyes of God, is the existence of the human soul. Because if what we are is just meat sacks that sort of compute every now and again, then, well, I'm better at computing, or I know people that are better at thinking than those people, so why shouldn't I pay the people that are better at thinking more? Or why shouldn't I value the things more that make me more comfortable? Or why should I care about how my workers are being treated? Because they're a resource to me. They are something that I can use to my advantage. And this, I think, people are wondering why communism gains traction, because it's obviously complete bullshit. Like, the logic of communism is obviously incoherent. But I think the reason that Karl Marx's ideas got traction is because in his Communist Manifesto, when he's outlining the issues with capitalism, he actually is correct. When he is outlining the problems that capitalism would abandon, what I've heard called laissez-faire capitalism, he's outlining those problems. He's actually right. But what makes Karl Marx a shitty mechanic is that he can tell you what's wrong with your car, but if he tries to fix it, he'll just make it worse.
Yeah, we have a tendency of seeing problems and not diagnosing them very well. I think Marxism is one of those. I think the sexual revolution is another in the same vein, because human people have a desire to be wanted and needed and seen and loved in a way that their jobs are no longer make them like their grandparents, perhaps, or great grandparents, if you're in the mindset of somebody in the 50s. Like they're not as valued or as cared for as they once were, perhaps. And though there's some right answers to that, but there's many wrong answers. One of them is a sexual revolution.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that's the only factor there, but it makes sense.
It's certainly not the only factor with the sexual revolution, but it's one of those reasons that Marxism and Marxist type ideologies can take hold, because you have the capitalist who thinks that because that, ultimately he may not profess it, but he, at least in his actions, denies the existence of the human soul. So he treats all of his workers as though they're meat machines. And when they complain, he just says, "Oh, what are you complaining about? You're being paid. Like, you have a job.
Mm-hmm.
Like, be grateful for the job you have, peon, peasant." Which, incidentally, people look down on the feudal system, and think that it's this horrible, terrible thing. Which I neglected to mention when I was talking about the Middle Ages. But that's more of a political structure than an economic one. I might backtrack in a little bit and talk more about the Middle Ages and how work was done in the Middle Ages, but but we're getting there.
I say visit it briefly, real quick. Like, well, how did things work in the feudal system? Were they peasants living on farms that just had to pay everything to their liege lord and do stuff for him, and then barely survive, or were they treated bad?
So,
and I know some of the answers to this, but
here's kind of the funny thing: a feudal system which existed sort of in the best way possible, both in Europe and in ancient Japan, feudal Japan, so pre-modern Japan. You have the king at the top, and then you have lords beneath him, and other lords or knights beneath them, and then you have serfs that are underneath them. It is something of a class-based system, but basically, the feudal system exists so that the king can make his will known and felt throughout his entire kingdom without actually having to physically go to every single town that he rules over, because, let's face it, if he tried that, he would be dead by the time he got back home. So basically, I, as the king, so if I were to conquer a place, then I would say, I am appointing you 4 as the guys directly under me, and I'm giving you 4 regions to rule directly under me.
Mhm.
So, so you have the king at the top, and then you have the dukes. And this is sort of how the British structure worked. You had the dukes, and then you had barons and counts under them.
Okay.
And then under the barons and counts, you kind of have just the average person, or the serf. And people think of the serf as like the slave, but it's not necessarily what a serf is. The average person in the Middle Ages kind of went about his life and just paid his taxes at the end of the year the way we do. Or paid his taxes on whatever, it could have it could have varied depending on who your lord was. But, it depended based on who your lord was, and whether it's at the end of the year, you pay your taxes quarterly or whatever. But you were subject to somebody immediately above you, who was subject immediately above him, who was subject to somebody immediately above him, who was ultimately subject to the king, who incidentally considered himself to be ultimately subject to God. And in many cases didn't necessarily think himself as being any more than politically above the people of his country. So you paid your taxes to the king, and that was ultimately how your nation made money.
Okay.
Was in that, and also in making trade deals and things with other nations, because tariffs have always been a thing in society. And like the merchant class exists kind of separate from this, both within it and without it at the same time. It's kind of weird how merchants operate.
Well, I've been reading the
because
Mistborn trilogy.
They're the ones that are constantly traveling, and they're they're kind of forging business alliances in other countries that may even coincide with political alliances.
I've been reading the Mistborn trilogy, and Sanderson hits the nail on the head when he has his 3 classes within Elend's new structure of government. It's the peasants, the noblemen, and the merchants. The merchants are their own creature.
And everyone is subject to the king, basically speaking.
Well, unless certain things, but that's spoilers for that those books. Which
Spoilers for anyone who hasn't read Mistborn yet, which you should.
excellent trilogy. So I started the third book, The Hero of Ages, today.
Very good, and good job actually reading it and not just cliff noting the whole thing.
Yeah, I did that for the second half of that book once. So
I don't blame you for doing that for the second one, but you should. Anyone watching, you should still read the book.
It was the second half of this book, I should say. I had listened to the rest via audiobook. I just hadn't read through them.
So, anyway, and the way that work was done, if we can then just draw the most stark possible comparison, we'll go back to the Middle Ages, and compare it to work done in the modern age, and the modern concept of work kind of coming out of the suburban area, the suburbanite age post World War II, of how jobs are. So in the Middle Ages, like I said, your work and your life were intrinsically connected.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a blacksmith, your forge was nearby your house, unless somebody called you to help put a wheel back on a wagon, or to fix a tool, or to fix something that needed fixing. Kind of the only people that needed to travel for work were merchants and nobles. The only people that really needed to leave a certain radius of their house were the merchant and the noble classes. Because that's just a necessity when you're a merchant or a noble. It's like you want to make sure that there's, when you're a noble, you want to make sure that your alliances are going to be secured, and that you don't have to go to war, and that you might have to go and see somebody else. And particularly because they didn't have telephones, you have to take the 6-month journey to go and see somebody for 20 minutes.
Makes sense. We take
and when you're a merchant, it works kind of the same way. So it works kind of the same way when you're a merchant.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how work was done back then, and it was almost entirely physical work. Men who worked in construction also had to go off to someplace, and they would be gone for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could be gone for 2 years at a time if you had a job working on a construction project, because they're building a castle 150 miles away, and you've been hired to do that. You can't exactly go home after work every day. So that might kind of be, that was kind of similar to how construction is now, with one clear difference, is that now, post industrialism and post factory mindset, now when you want to build a building, you got to get 17 different crews and schedule them to come in at the same time. Like you have to have a specific crew come in just to put your windows in. You got your concrete guys, you got your timber guys, you got your electrician, you got your plumber, you got your heavy equipment operators, you've got all sorts of. It creates, now we have like the construction trades. Back then, it was just everybody just works in construction, and then basically the entire construction crew is together for the majority of the process. And if they're rolling people through, it's people who know how to do everything. Also, because buildings were a heck of a lot more simple back then. You don't need an electrician if electricity doesn't exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need a plumber if there's no indoor plumbing. But it's sort of, everybody kind of knows how to do everything on that crew. Because there's still very different things that could, in theory, be specialized. Like you did have to have to know how to set up timber. You did know how to mix concrete, or you had to know how to mix concrete, and you did know how to lay stone. Now there were stonemasons whose job it was to quarry and cut the stone, but they were more the guys that were delivering the building material than necessarily the guys who were always laying it.
It seems to me that a theme of this, of just that example, and of a lot of what's been said, is like the movements of that are ones that make sense if done right, and can be done better, can be done well, it can be not done well. So if you have a crew of people that are generally all working on the same thing, like there's not much specialty in it, everybody show up and build this thing. We'll divvy out tasks. There's some people more experienced at things than others, whatever. Like, we're all going to build this thing.
Mm-hmm.
People are naturally within that going to gravitate towards specialties. One, because it's easier for you as a specialized person, and B, because it makes it easier for everybody else if they know, like, okay, I don't have to be the expert at everything. I get my one domain of this, or my one subdomain of this domain of building this building. And he's got his domain, and so now you work as a team. Then it makes sense to apply that to teams themselves. And okay, now my team, like, well, there's some really big stuff coming up. There's a bunch of us that are really, really good at, the timber side. Okay, fine. Well, we're just going to be timber people, and we're going to find another team that's decided to do similar stuff, but their thing was welding, or whatever the case was. And it's like, all of that makes sense. All of that can work really well together, and can also be a pain in the ass. And
so my counterpoint,
it's just a question of how is it done? How is it done?
Again, it's a question of how is it done. For example, an apartment building constructed in 1950, if left unattended, wouldn't last until 1970. But we have castles that are still standing, granted with maintenance. But we have castles that are still standing with much less maintenance than is required in the apartment building, and have been standing for 500, 600, 700, even 1,000 years.
So even though the transition makes sense, by your fruits you shall judge them.
Precisely. And that ultimately is the ultimate result of wanting to mass produce something.
Mm-hmm.
It's ultimately the overall quality of that thing will drop. And there was a movement in the 1920s, again, after factories and mass production was in full swing, but kind of around the same time, or a little bit before and slightly after the introduction of the assembly line by Henry Ford. There was a movement in the 1920s called the craftsman movement that it was more of an artistic and architectural movement. And its primary result was furniture. It was the craftsman style of furniture, where basically a company that operated, or the guy who came up with it, operated his company on the basis of, well, I'm not going to produce stuff in a factory where I have one guy whose specific job is to make table legs all day, or where I have one guy whose specific job is to drill holes in table legs all day, or to sand a table leg all day.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what I'm going to do is I am going to sort of form this organization of craftsmen, of professional carpenters who know what they're doing and they know really well. And we're going to get together and we're going to design furniture that a carpenter can produce well, but entirely on his own. One man, one chair. And what you have there is, I think, kind of the best of both worlds, rather than... And they were made to order, too. So it wasn't we're going to have a massive warehouse full of stock that somebody may or may not buy.
And it was furniture, so it wasn't like, your burger that you got at the drive-thru, we only put it on the grill when you ordered it.
Yeah.
There's...
But this stuff was all made to order. And so basically they would get an order for it. So say somebody ordered, a craftsman chair. Well, then that order gets handed to one of the guys who works for them, and they may all even work in the same place. It may be something like, it may appear like a factory or like a factory town. but everybody, the entire project from start to finish is done by the same guy or the same couple of guys.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, which is the biggest problem with the assembly line. The assembly line, it's not, well, this starts as raw material on the end of the line, and then once it's traveled 2 miles to the other end of the factory and gone through the hands of 47 different people, then it's a finished product.
Instead,
The
it's
only guy who gets to see the finished product is the guy who puts the wheels on the car.
no, Matilda wants a chair. You're gonna make Matilda a chair.
Yeah.
And to your point about it being the best of both worlds, like I don't know how anybody can argue with that. I don't know how anybody can listen to that and say like that isn't the ideal world.
Yeah, where a man is able to do his craft the best way he knows how, even if he's following plans that either somebody else or some group of people that he's with have come up with because they're efficient but still very, very attractive plans. It's a still very, very attractive design. I love Craftsman furniture. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, and I plan on making some of my own at some point. But it sort of combines the goods of the idea of the factory, which is we can produce more things faster, but also the old world idea of producing a product, which is I start with nothing, or I start with raw materials, and I am the one that makes it 100% all the way through. Which really that's artisanship. And there are companies that do this nowadays. So there are a lot of sword companies that, at least when they claim to be hand-forged weapons, well, they have craftsmen that will forge all of the weapons, and they'll do it from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows every step, the entire process. He doesn't have to just be taught this one thing. It's not, okay, Bill, you're going to be taught how to make the handle, and George, you're going to be taught how to make the hilt, and Tom, you're going to be taught how to make the blade, and Jim, you're going to be taught how to sharpen the blade, and then Fred down at the end of the line is going to put all of them together. Technically, that produces you can probably get more product pushed out that way.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really see the entire process, and nobody sees the entire process, and it really, when when all of your progress at work, when all of your progress of your work is only on a piece of paper, and you don't actually see, you can't go home and say, hey honey, I built a car today. It's
50 fenders is far less impressive than one car.
Yeah, I attached 50 fenders to frames today.
Yeah.
That's almost demeaning to you, which is why for the pure assembly line, I think it's probably a good thing that robots be taking over for that sort of thing when you have one thing that does one specific job, because a robot is literally just a soulless machine. A robot is exactly what the corporatist and industrialist elite of the last couple centuries have treated human beings as. A robot is precisely that.
So in the business world, the way you would get around that, or the way you would reintroduce dignity of the worker to the guy that is attaching all of the fenders, is you teach your people to focus on the larger objectives and focus on like, okay, don't just be locked into what am I doing? What's the pointlessness of what I'm doing? But instead focus on the company as a whole, focus on its objectives, like see how you're making a big difference for that. That only works long term if the company has a culture and a mission that you can believe in and that you actually do believe in.
Yes.
And if any part of that is false, then it's going to suffer. It's you're part of a organization that is flawed in one way or another, or just not performing, or something else. Like I'm lucky at my job. Like I have a great culture. Like I really respect their culture, but I also
Yes.
think I can count myself lucky in that sense, because even with more of a movement in the business world for quite some time now, to reintroduce human values and dignity to the worker, not just in the form of like greater benefits, but just in terms of like, okay, how are people actually cared for? Even though that is on the rise, there's still going to be plenty of places where it's not, because again, this stuff has to be done. You know, this system, just like any other system, needs to be implemented right for human beings to flourish.
Oh, the fallenness of man.
Yay. And on that note, I will pause for a second drink, because the fallenness of man needs liquor.
I'm going to stick with just the one because my wife gives me funny looks if I refill my glass.
Okay. So you can take a page out of my playbook. I am not refilling my glass. I have a separate glass. And it will sit, in another shameless plug, on some coasters that I got from a handy fellow who happens to be with me on this podcast. So,
The link to the shop will be in the description,
yes, it will.
as will the link to my Kindle store.
They are ordinary and yet extraordinary.
So, to return to the discussion, sort of like where we started and where we've come, as far as work is concerned, I think you are right about a lot of what certain jobs can do to restore dignity to the worker.
Mhm.
But I think societally as a whole, I think it would be good to start encouraging jobs that sort of just intrinsically have dignity. Now, I fully acknowledge that it is not that work doesn't dignify a man dignifies his work. But a cab driver can be just as dignified as the president of the United States. That's kind of the American dream, right there.
Not just the American dream, I think the spiritual dream. Like, work is, yeah, a man dignifies his work. It might be harder to do it with others. And I agree with the idea of wanting to shift things in a direction where work that is more easily seen as dignified is encouraged. In short,
Right.
treating work, having it be less of an assembly line type of job and more of a craftsman type of job. I think you can
It's
turn even
artisanship.
Exactly. If you can encourage more of that, the entire world would be better. And the world wants to move towards that. It craves moving towards that. Like earlier in this discussion, I was thinking like we rebel against HOAs for the same reason. We rebel against walking into another house in your same suburb and realizing I've seen the same damn floor plan 2 houses, down the road.
Yeah.
Like, this is boring. And so you step into a house that somebody hand built or was built before then. It's like, this is unique. This is awesome. Like, this is really cool. It doesn't even have to make a ton of sense as a layout necessarily. Like, if it's unique, like, it probably makes some sense and it's cool.
Well, and there was even sort of a craftsmanship element to the construction of the home back in the day. So my house was built in 1924. And there's a particular style of, I forget what the style of architecture is, but it's a particular style of house.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the houses in the neighborhood, particularly the ones just this way and that way, and right across the street, they're built in the same style, but they're still different.
Exactly. Very different.
And I think that the biggest difference between driving through a neighborhood that was built in the 20s and driving through a neighborhood that was built after the 1960s or even after the 1950s is when you drive through the neighborhood that was built in the 20s, all of the houses they're either similar but different in exactly the right ways. So they may have a similar facade but a slightly different floor plan. They have variations in all of the right places.
Okay.
To where it's still like that house is still its own particular thing.
And again, this is what range of years?
Like if we're looking at, and this is just my experience in house hunting and things like that, like the 20s and the 30s and into the 40s.
Okay.
When houses are built. And even like before the 1920s, up until about the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
I list that because that's like the greatest range. That's sort of where the greatest number of houses that we can still find are going to come from.
Okay.
Like from the 20s to the 40s. But then once you get, again, post-World War II, when you get like the cookie cutter homes, like these houses are all literally exactly the same. And or you get like the model home. You know, where it's like, come and choose from one of our 4 different houses that we have. Like a neighborhood was built not far from where I grew up, where basically what they've done is they've taken 4 different styles of house, 4 different models of house, and made 100 of each one, and then just sort of scattered them.
I mean, it's not much different.
But what that does is it makes your house pretty much identical to the one that's 3 doors down.
It's not much different from apartment shopping. Being like, yeah, we have 5 floor plans to choose from at various ranges. Pick one.
Yes.
It's something. And it makes some sense if you figure like, well, we're not building a neighborhood for this house for Matilda, this house for Jeffrey, this house for Sam. But no, we're building this neighborhood for whoever these people will be. We're going to sell them all after the fact. It makes sense, but there's less soul to it.
Yeah, and then what they do now is they make the houses just different enough that you can technically say that they're different. But really, what all that they've done is they may have changed the color of the brick. Like this one, instead of red brick, has brown brick. Ooh. It's so unique.
I know. Well,
but that's yet another digression into architecture, which is going to be another rant in another topic in another episode.
Which should probably follow the same theme, but yes. On the subject of work, though, so we've talked about the factory system, the suburb system, how that changes who takes what jobs and what the constitution of those jobs are, because I guess if you're more well-off, you're not going to want a manual job, you're going to want a more service-based job. And a service-based job is going to affect more people, and you're going to, at least in theory, be more intelligent, so you're going to get paid more. And it's going to kick the poorer people into the other stuff. And that continues for a while, and then we have the internet.
Well, see, what that wound up doing, though, because there was also this... I have to dip the toe into education, even though we said that's going to be a different episode, because it's you can't talk about work without talking about education at some point. There was a time in the 20th century when having a university degree was an almost guarantee that you were going to wind up with a decent paying job. And what that winds up doing is, I think it all has to do with the proportion of the classes. And what the suburb system ultimately did was create a middle class. Rather than have the rich and the poor, now we have the, well, technically not rich, but also technically not poor.
Okay.
We are having the people who are getting by on a higher standard of living. So the rich have significantly more than they need and a significantly high standard of living. The poor have significantly less than they need and a significantly low standard of living, and they might just get by, but on that very low standard of living. But the middle class just gets by on a high standard of living. That's basically kind of the difference, and that's what the suburbs basically invented. Or it at least caused the extreme growth of the middle class. So it wasn't always necessarily linked to having a college degree or having a specific kind of education to get a good and decent paying job. But because, well, there became this idea of, well, working the land and doing, and labor, well, that's for poor people. And we don't want to be poor anymore. So we had a lot of people who had worked in the land, who had worked in labor, and even genuine artisans who wound up moving to the suburbs and getting some cushy office job.
I think Mike Rhodes talked about that very thing, like being brought into his school guidance counselor's office when he was in high school or something, and shown a poster, a recruitment poster for college, and it just shows you two paths in life. One is for the smiling dentist or lawyer or whatever, and one is for the unhappy tradesman. And it's not a good picture to show people. It really is not. It's not and beyond a picture,
and
it's
then
not a
he
good
wound
ethos to have.
He wound up saying screw both of them and wound up being a classically trained Shakespearean actor.
Great.
But then wound up using that to make the tradesmen look less unhappy. Basically, he used his using a platform to glorify the trades.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a wonderful thing that Mike Rowe has done in what he's doing.
It's a good combo of both worlds.
Yeah, of physical work. Because he doesn't say that, well, literally every office job needs to go away because they're all completely unnecessary. Because I think there are a couple of ways of approaching this question. And it kind of is... So you can say, well, the only people we really need are the trades. So, Wall Street can just crumble into the ocean because it should really just be all about the trades. And then there's like another camp that says, well, yeah, we have the trades, but only because they're absolutely necessary, and that's what poor people do. Which, I mean, if you actually look at the numbers, tradesmen get paid extremely well.
Yes, and they should.
Mostly, they should, and, strong union.
Yeah. I don't like being the idea of a plumber, the idea of being a plumber working 60 hours a week, but it can make you six figures.
The reason that tradesmen work so well is because so many people, or the reason that being a tradesman pays so well, is because so many people have been told for so long that they don't want to do it.
That too.
The town that my dad grew up in, do you know who the richest man in town was?
The electrician?
A garbage guy. Because nobody wants to pick up the trash. And they will pay almost anything
that is insane.
For somebody else to haul off their trash.
That reminds me of like
And he winds up being the richest guy in town because he says, I have no sense of smell. I'll haul off your trash.
Reminds me of like some modern folks that have made a ton of money off of being in rich neighborhoods and just doing a regular pooper scooper run on your backyard for your pets. And pay $20 for 5 minutes worth of work. You could make bank.
You're gonna make bank.
Yep. Because somebody didn't want to pick up their dog shit. It's amazing how rich you can get off of just people's convenience,
So dog walkers should be charging more. That's the most interesting. That's one of the most fun jobs, I think, that has come out of the modern age.
Oh, they already do.
The dog walker.
If you wanted to make some neat side money, just make yourself a dog sitter. Like if you could probably charge somebody $1,000 if they go out of town for a week and they want you to watch your dog and feed them, care for them, all that stuff. Just saying.
The thing is, I know exactly the kind of person that would be paying $1,000 to have somebody watch a dog for a weekend. And I know exactly what kind of dogs those people have. And I want absolutely nothing to do with those people or those dogs.
What if they're beautiful black labs or something? I don't know.
Black labs are nuts.
They're friendly.
The black lab is a dog that was bred to hunt ducks. And has been turned into a family dog because it's pretty and has been overbred and over-inbred. So it's a working dog that got turned into a pet is what it is, and that drives those things insane.
So I just need the less bred version of that. Cool.
Good luck finding one.
Okay.
Anyway, again, off the digression, maybe we'll talk about dogs some other time. Now, we are still talking about work.
Tangents are going to happen. That's all right.
So coming back around, I think this sort of idea of, oh, well, we're going to grow the middle class, and we're going to sort of glorify this idea of the middle class as being what is normal, even though, like, what even is your job? Of this middle class of the guy who just goes and sits in an office for 8 hours a day. There's sort of this glorification of that, and sort of a looking down of the nose on honest, hard work with your hands. And that still exists, which is why common laborers don't get paid anywhere near as much as they should. And still, on a whole, in a lot of places, they don't get paid anywhere near as much as they should. And their conditions are still garbage. And, anybody listening, if you work in a factory and it's a great place to work and you work with great people and you work for great people, all power to you. But yeah, I know that there's a lot of factories out there that make it hard to dignify the work. We'll put it that way.
Absolutely. That's a fair way to put it, I think. And yet the insurance guy still has an honest job, too. He ought not look down on the plumber who comes and does his plumbing while he sits in the world of insurance. Well, just like the plumber need not look down on the, supposedly some scumbag insurance salesman that he has to do the plumbing for.
Yes.
I think there's an attitude of mutual respect that needs to be cultivated. And we have not served that, to your earlier points, by glorifying one over the other. And when you make a massive shift from one thing to another, it's natural that the old gets looked down upon in favor of the new.
And I'm not going to say that it was like every trade where you worked with your hands was necessarily looked down upon.
Mm-hmm.
Because the plumber was still respected, the carpenter was still respected. The people who, it was obvious to the average person were necessary, they were still respected. I think I'm talking mostly about the common laborer and the cab driver and, the people that do just get by on a very low standard of living and not necessarily through any fault of their own.
Mm-hmm.
There was something of a looking down on that sort of people.
Yep, absolutely.
Because again, they're the poor, and we don't want anybody to be poor anymore. But then you have the idea of, well, if I start charging more for my product, then fewer people are going to buy it, and I'm ultimately going to wind up making less money. So if I pay my workers literally as little as I possibly can, which incidentally is also why we need minimum wage laws, as much as I wish I could stand up and champion for the no, let everybody work for their pay, we actually do need minimum wage laws.
I've heard arguments for it. I've heard arguments against it. Yeah.
Maybe we'll get into that at the tail end of this,
or some other time. Minimum
because
wage
again,
this
is
interesting.
Again, my view is more of a both and rather than an either or.
Mm-hmm.
So
generally, both and views are healthier. So
usually, yeah. It's almost like that's what being Catholic is.
How does the internet change this? Because it seems to me that it takes the factory line, or it takes some utilitarianism and just makes it even greater. It distances you from your work. It distances you from the people that you're helping, which in effect is your work. So, like, without even getting into the COVID stuff and the work from home things, if my job is to work in a cubicle and no longer take care of my town, no longer have an office I sit in and say, I'm the insurance guy, but I'm the insurance guy for, Maple Grove, Minnesota. So I expect to take care of the people of Maple Grove, Minnesota, and the surrounding towns. But no, now I'm taking care of people in South Dakota because I can, and because it helps to grow my business. And now I'm taking care of people in northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Texas because why not? And Maryland because why not? Or the places themselves don't matter. Again, there's a great good to that. Now I can feed my family a heck of a lot easier.
Well, and this is
But I'm also distanced from the people that I'm helping. And it's easier for that work to be less dignified than it is by me. It's less personal.
I do see where you're coming from this. But if I can throw something in your face, you're not married and I am. With the internet being as it is, and with technology being on a level that it is, I think what we can see is what I would like to see is a lot more jobs that historically have been just done in a cubicle, done at home. Personally, I would like to see this because, yes, when you work for a company and when you have co-workers and when you have colleagues,
Mm-hmm.
you want to be able to treat your colleagues with respect and you want to be able to treat your boss with respect. And yes, that's all well and good. But when you are a husband and a father, your obligation to your wife and your children goes beyond only providing for their physical needs. That is how sort of the utilitarian, corporatist, capitalist, and industrialist mindset has affected the minds of even the relations within the family. It basically, in the old days, a man did have his trade and he spent the majority of his day with doing his trade. But in the old days didn't have this, well, a man does the work and the woman raises the children sort of idea. It was, well, the father has a trade and he provides for the family, but he does more than just put the food on the table.
Yeah.
He does more than just bring in the harvest, and he does more because then that's basically the family just treating their father like a workhorse.
Yep.
And like a machine. That's all he's good for. And then housewives start thinking, well, that's all my husband is good for, is a job, is to give me money so I can buy a new hat.
Yep.
Basically, is how the wife winds up thinking of her husband. And then, the husband can start taking this idea of, well, the wife is the one who raises the children. He can take that way too far. And that's when you get, the I never spoke to my father until my college graduation joke.
Great.
Like, oh, didn't you have a wonderful father?
Yeah.
And if it wasn't his fault, then I am horribly sorry for both you and him. But a good father does literally everything in his power to be with his children. Basically, I think what I'm trying to say is that when you're a husband and a father, your responsibility is, yes, to put food on the table for your family, and you should do everything in your power to do that. You should find whatever means is necessary for you to do that best. For you to best do that. But the sort of broad term of, the woman raises the children.
Mm-hmm.
Women are nurturers, so they raise the children. When they're infants and toddlers, yeah, they're going to spend more time with mom than they do with dad. That's just natural.
Mm-hmm. Well, they need to. They need that connection. But
But you can take that way too far, and then the father basically contributes nothing.
Yep. And then you get a culture where everybody is overmothered and underfathered, and it sucks. It sucks.
So here's what I see in. And, my knowledge of the 1950s comes partially from study, but also just partially from watching a lot of old American sitcoms, because you can actually find great case studies in that.
Yeah.
So the Cub Scouts used to operate on the system of the den mother. or it used to literally just be a woman in charge of all of the boys until they became the Boy Scouts, and then they had a Scoutmaster who was a man. It was like the transition from being primarily the mother's responsibility to primarily the father's responsibility, at least for boys, is at age 11.
Okay.
And that seems way too late for me.
Same. I do not like this idea,
That,
as I hear
like,
it.
I would take that. Like, I already try to monopolize as much time with my son as I possibly can, and he's not even 1.5. Like, all right, you can walk and you can kind of swing a bat. You're coming with me. It's basically how it is, and you're starting to learn how to wrestle. That's awesome. That's come here, boy. We're gonna do some guy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think boys were kept from being boys in that sort of context for a long time because mothers worry too much.
And to your point, because fathers are off doing their 40 or 50 hours a week, just providing.
Exactly. When
And
there's no dad around, when there is no grown man around for however long, 8 to 10 hours a day or more, depending on how much he works and how much his commute time is.
Mm-hmm.
When all you have is your mom and maybe your older brother, then you don't know your father. And so probably my and my wife's favorite old TV sitcom is My Three Sons. And the premise is this man who has recently, at the beginning of the show, in the very first episode, this man has recently lost his wife. And he has 3 boys. 3 sons. But he has no woman in the house. So his wife's father comes to live with them and do all the cooking and all the cleaning and all the sewing. He's their grandfather. It's literally just a house full of men.
Sounds like a great time.
Because they have, like, at the start of the show, the oldest son, I think, is 16. The second oldest is 14, and the youngest is 9.
So what I expect to envision in my head is a TV, a lot of guns, and a lot of empty cans of Coke.
That's what it would look like nowadays, but it's slightly more dignified looking given that it was 1960.
Okay, fine.
It's a little bit more, a little bit fancier.
There is a humble dignity to a can of Coke, though.
Yes, there is. Although personally, I prefer the glass bottle. I think that's a little bit fairer of form than the can.
All right.
But I think one of my personal favorite episodes is later on in the series when the youngest boy, in his is in a Cub Scout den, and this Cub Scout den is all the neighborhood boys. Well, there are a couple of older boys that like to just kind of mess with them and will bully them, and like will run through and knock over a project or whatever, and just sort of and they're obnoxious bullies that are 2-3 years older.
Yeah. And
their previous den mother keeps sort of drilling it into these boys' heads. So like, well, we mustn't retaliate. We must rise above. We must rise above that. Because we are better than stooping so low as to, get our hands dirty or whatever. So we fast forward just a little bit, and this den mother, her husband gets a job someplace else, so she has to move. Or she can't be the den mother anymore for whatever reason. So they need to pick a new one. And so Chip, who is the youngest son, says, "Oh, I have an idea. I haven't got a mother, but my grandfather is the closest thing to a woman in the house, so why don't we ask him to be our den mother?"
All right.
And so, somehow he winds up getting, this curmudgeon-y old Irishman winds up getting accepted as the den mother for these boys. And they're having, near the end, they have a bake sale. And all these boys are there with these cakes and these brownies and these pies. And then along come these 2 bullies that, they start sticking their fingers in things and licking them. And and just being obnoxious.
Yeah.
So then the grandfather comes up behind these two boys, and he puts his hands on their necks and says, "Oh, you like the cakes, do you? Well, then have some." And he smashes their heads into the cakes in front of them.
Sweet.
He just smashes their faces into the cakes in front of them, which is exactly what these boys needed.
Mm-hmm.
They needed a man to show them their place, or at least to take them down a peg.
Because there is a place for meekness, but there is also you are the king of your castle.
Yes.
And
blessed are the
this
meek;
is-
they shall inherit the earth. That's
yes. But
I acknowledge that.
But it is not the domain of a mother to be the sole teacher of your son on what it is to be a king and a husband.
Precisely.
And a father. They have a role, but only a role.
Well, because the mother is wired to better take care of the smallest of children, like children younger than 3,
Mm-hmm.
when they most need it, at least like maybe 5 and under, but like children pre-age of reason, the mother is best wired to handle children of that age because they don't really understand their emotions and they don't really understand a lot of things, and they need nurturing and they need caring.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what mothers are very good at. And what fathers are very good at is bringing down the hammer, which is something you do a little bit tougher with somebody that's beyond the age of reason and is actually able to understand why we have the rules that we have and why you shouldn't break them.
Yep.
So when you wind up having a work culture in which a job is done, in which the father's job takes him away from the home, like, see, I'm going to go to work. He leaves the house and he is gone for 8 hours a day. And then you're leaving all of your children entirely in the hands of the mother, who is capable, but the mother by herself is not necessarily the best for children who are beyond the age of reason. So I would say, but like before the age of 6, it should be primarily the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's when children kind of need the most nurturing. After the age of 6, the responsibility for raising the children can kind of start to be shared between the mother and the father, because that's kind of where girls and boys kind of start to come into their own even more, and where girls need to be taught how to be ladies and boys need to be taught how to be men. And when dad is gone 10 hours a day, every 5 days a week, or 6, all year long, you have nobody at home. Which is why, boys wind up needing to replace their dad with a hero of some kind. Whether it's somebody from the television or, in a more constructive way, it might be the policeman whose beat takes him past your block. When a man's job takes him away from home the majority of the time, the children are not exposed to their father. And even if you have a fantastic dad who is able to do that, and who is still able, when he comes home from work, the first thing he does is he picks his children up and he kisses them and he gives them hugs and he wrestles with them and whatever. Even with that, there will still be something lacking. Because you can really only get to know people by spending time with them.
True.
So to an extent, he won't really know his children, and his children won't know him, at least not as well as a man whose job is pretty much entirely at home. Or is hybrid. Which is why, again, the answer is not necessarily, everybody just needs to take a job at home. I think, again, it's a both and. Hybrid work is possibly one of the best outcomes for certain office type work. Possibly one of the best outcomes of the post-COVID era.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's, of course, anybody could point upsides and downsides to it, and to that I would just reply with one of the themes, like, it's a system that can work great or badly, depending on who you are and how you make use of it and how it's implemented.
Yes.
But it's a great thing. It
Yes.
really is. At one point in my career, I had a job where I was in the office. And I loved the fact that I was in the office because I loved the fact that I could be around the people that I was serving. Like, I worked on the second floor of this credit union. If somebody was on the bottom floor, I preferred, at least some of the time, walking down the floor to go help them as opposed to, well, let me get on the phone with you and let me remote in your system. Remoting in their system's actually more, it makes my job easier. I have more tools at my disposal to help them if I do that.
Right.
But there's something I lose as well, and so I like that. And yet, speaking as an unmarried man, one of the things I would love to be able to do with my job one day, when God willing I do have a family, is share that job with them. And not just tell them about it at the end of the day, but actually like bring my kids to work and show them like, hey, here's what I'm doing. Here's this, here's the stuff I'm working on. Maybe it's cool, maybe it's not. Who cares? It's stuff I as their dad am doing. Even if I'm doing the most mundane password reset in the world in my IT job, I can still say I'm saving the world, And there's something neat to that I want to be able to share with them. Personally, like a dream job I have that's like the best hybrid of this is be the small town IT guy who just knows everybody and fixes everybody's crap. And can bring my kids with them if I want, because, maybe the wife said a part-time job. All right, cool. You're coming with me. We're going to go troubleshoot this stupid Excel problem, or why is the internet down at, the grocery store, or why is the gift shop having, problems getting this one documented function properly, or what in the world is a network switch? Like, let me show you what a network switch is. Can I have you help me do some of that stuff? Like,
Right.
it'd be such a cool experience. And I'm not saying you have to have a job out and about town to do that. If you can share your job at home with your kids in that sense, like, do it. Like, I know workplace confidentiality is a thing. Try and find a way to do it. Try and find a way. It's,
Yes.
bring them into it so that you can spend more time with them.
And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that there aren't jobs that are necessary for society to run properly that would require a man's attention for 40 hours a week or more consistently.
Mm-hmm.
Or would require, a different location. Like, for example, if you're an electrician, you kind of have to go to wherever the job is.
Yep.
And that exactly. I fully understand. But also, I think pay structures can be a part of that.
Say more about that.
Because so for example, most tradesmen get paid by the job.
Yeah, you just quote parts and labor, basically.
Yeah, you get paid for the job that you have done. And it's in your best interest to get the job done quickly so that you can then go and do another job. This is how roofers work. So a roofing crew is paid basically by the roof, as the pay is distributed amongst the roofers on the crew. So they have a vested interest in getting it done quickly, but also getting it done well. Because they know if they have a good boss, he's going to come along and see if they have done the roof improperly. Then he'll say, guess what? Now you're going to take it off and put it back on, and you're not getting paid for that. But roofers get paid basically by the roof, so they're incentivized to then do more roofs.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you make more money that way. But, there could also sort of be this, I have a target for my financial needs, and once I have reached that target for like my financial needs for whatever this period is, then once I've reached that target, then I'm just going to stop. Or once I've gone a little bit past that target so I could have a little bit of a cushion, then I'm going to change my priorities a little bit. Or I'm going to sort of flex the way that I do the work Again, so I'm not trying to make as much money as possible.
Which
and
is
so that I can go home and spend as much time with my kids as I possibly can.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
I can buy my kids all the cool toys in the world, but if they don't have me, then those amount to nothing.
I would agree. And to make one quick point to anybody listening who's like, okay, all of these things are awesome, well and good. But yeah, I have one of those jobs you talked about that needs to be done um needs to be done out of the house 50 hours a week. Because it's salaried and because, well, that's my job, and it's not just my job, but it's my calling. Fair enough.
Right.
Like we're proposing
Yes.
the highest possible thing, but the highest possible thing is only so important when it comes to your calling. Your calling is your calling. That's your job.
And the best
Dude,
possible good, the best possible actual good often has to do with where people are at and are meant to be.
exactly. If you want to know what the will of God is, to paraphrase Father Sisek, and he leadeth me, look around you. That's kind of not from him. That's from something Hollow did about that series, but whatever. It's cool. And also take comfort, those of you out there, because you're not alone in that. You have a actual army of people around you that are all facing the same struggles, and you can raise your kids in a holy fashion. It's going to be tough. It's going to be challenges, but no, welcome to life. At minimum, aim to bring the qualities of a craftsman to your work, and aim to bring the ethos of a craftsman to your work, even if it's not a craftsman-style job. I'm an IT guy that takes care of people's crap. And yet, it would behoove me to be a craftsman at my job and to say, well, I can do the baseline, or I can present a more human touch, or they can say, I'm not taking care of ticket, 13459. I'm taking care of, Joey Green at, this store in Ohio. And, he's got his idiosyncrasies. I can have a good conversation with him and I can help him out. Like, if you do that as an IT guy or as an insurance person, just to go back to two we've talked about, or pick any other type of job, not only are you going to be way better at your job than the people around you, but you're going to gain more fulfillment out of it, and you're going to see it as more dignified than you would otherwise. And is that not worth it?
In other words, strive for a world in which nobody is a number.
But a person.
And nobody is a piece of a machine.
Have human relations, not human resources.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've just figured out our actual title for this particular episode.
Perhaps we have. Perhaps we have. And if you can, work at home. Work at home.
Yes. Particularly, well, I would actually say that only if you have children.
Yeah, good point.
Most notably if you have children, because if you have no children and are not in a position to then have children in the future, and you are actively seeking just to work from home, you're kind of a loser.
Yeah. And don't take what I said in the most literal sense, because my actual answer would be whatever accomplishes the job best of living in a true, good, and beautiful way.
Whatever it takes
that's the right
for
answer
you,
for you. But
yeah, whatever it takes for you to have an actual work-life balance. As much as I despise that phrase, as much as it takes for you, then let me say it properly. As much as it takes for you, do what it takes for you to work well and live well.
I like that. That can be perhaps more easily centered around who are you living for, as opposed to just, oh, I have stress I have to deal with.
The single man kind of just lives for himself.
Point taken.
But the married man, those shots were not intended to be fired.
I know.
But basically, you should work well, and you ought to work well, and you ought to live well. And you should have whatever job allows you to do both. So if working 40 or 50 hours, pulling a lever in a factory, causes you to come home and then have to take a nap for an hour and not be able to spend time with your children, I would find other work. Because when you are a husband and a father, your priority is your wife and your children, and they are the ones that you are living for. And they don't just need the money in their pocket. If you need to have fewer nice things, have fewer nice things. Because your children would rather be with you than be with whatever fancy thing you bought them for Christmas.
And no one cares about your man cave. Or even your whiskey, as much as I like whiskey.
Yeah.
People care about who you raised.
Or even your fancy pipe.
Yes.
A man's children appreciate when he is able to spend time with them, because children actually do need to be seen, and they do need to be heard, and they do need to be loved by both their mother and their father constantly, as often as possible. And as few men as want to admit it, you need it too.
Yep.
A man needs to be around his wife and children.
If you do it,
the man gets...
You're not going to complain.
The corporate world tears the man out of his home for 8 to 10 hours every day, and people wonder why he becomes dissatisfied with his wife.
Yeah.
People wonder why his eye wanders after a couple beers at the company Christmas party. Now, the counter to that is, they say that absence makes the heart grow fonder and familiarity breeds contempt. I don't think those things are both entirely true. And I will say something to...
They're true. They're true with certain other conditions.
Yes.
Like something else has gone wrong.
And I will say something to... I will say something to getting up and going to work in the morning and kissing your wife goodbye, and then coming home, pulling up in front of your house, getting out of the car, and your wife is waiting in the door with a baby on her hip. I think what every man truly wants is when he comes home from work, he wants to be hit with a kiss and a pot roast and not have to think about his job anymore.
Because the job only mattered for a point.
When the job is purely a tool, and I have made this known in every job I've had since being married, the job is a tool to keep a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't care less what tool I use to do that.
It is a calling, but it is not the highest. Or the second highest. It is in service.
There's a reason primary vocation is a term.
Yep.
So my first obligation is to my family.
Mm-hmm.
My second obligation is money, basically. My second obligation is the job, the employment.
Mm-hmm.
But there needs to be a shift in priorities from, well, let's all be comfortable, to let's all be virtuous. There needs to be a shift in priorities from, well, let's glorify the job that overworks me and but still pays me well, because I can buy nice things for my kids and they can live in a nice house. And instead say, let's honor the man who maybe doesn't make a whole lot of money, but his children grow into fine people.
We have a plan to end this with a particular line from a particular book. And I think this is a perfect segue to
And I think this is a very good time to say it.
Indeed.
Let me go through it, because this particular book also has, like, half of it is appendix. So.
Yeah. It's the end of the book. And if none of you knows what this book is, you need to read it tomorrow.
And if you haven't figured it out at this point, well, there's 2 others that you should probably read before it.
Yes.
If you haven't figured it out at this point, you're about to. But Sam returned to Bywater, and so came back up the hill as they went, as day was ending once more. And he went on, and there was yellow light and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. Peace be with you all, and we will see you next time, when we will talk about education.
Indeed we will. Thanks for joining us.
Salud.